was to build an altar at the site where the original altar stood. This is even before the temple was reconstructed. Built by the priest Yeshua and then by Zerubbabel, who was the governor. Ezra tells us that when the old men who had remembered Solomon's temple, when they saw the foundations being laid and the poor quality of the whole thing, the whole project, it says they wept with a loud voice. The younger men shouted for joy because they were seeing the temple go up, but the old men remembered what the original temple had looked like. The temple that was built after the Babylonian captivity stood there until the time of King Herod. This is the Herod of St. Luke's Gospel, where it talks about Herod the Great and in the days of Herod and how a decree went out from Caesar Augustus and so forth. This is the Herod. This is the Herod that had the boys 2 and under killed in Bethlehem. And Herod decided that to get to the heart of the Jewish people, he would build them a new temple. The Jews, however, did not trust him. And so they would not allow the old temple to come down until the new temple was erected around it, and then they allowed it to be taken away, because they thought maybe Herod was playing a trick on them. Now Herod rebuilt the temple in more glory and spaciousness than even existed at the time of Solomon. And I'll show you in a moment how he flattened the top of Mount Moriah and he built this gorgeous temple. It took 46 years to construct, and it was magnificent. And it was the building of the day. It certainly had to be, though it's not counted as such, one of the 7 wonders of the world. And I'll show you some of the reasons for that in a moment as well. But I want you to see the temple here while I have this picture up here, because you can see this is the eastern gate right here. This is the gate, the wall around the temple on the eastern side, the eastern gate. And all the gates were in a straight line. Can you see? All these gates were in a straight line. So if you stood on the steps of the sanctuary and you looked out through this gate, which is called the Nicanor gate, and you could look out, this is the court of the women, a very prominent court, but you could see all the way over to the Mount of Olives because all the gates were lined up in perfection, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Now again, in order to build his temple, King Herod leveled the top of the mountain and built a large retaining wall. The only thing that is left of the temple today is the retaining wall that went around its perimeter. Part of that retaining wall you can see here, and this is called the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, where the Jews pray today. They do not go up onto the Temple Mount to pray. They pray here. And this is their most holy site. Of all the sites the Jews control or are involved with, this is their most holy site. The wall is divided. This upper side for the men, this side for the women. There's a screen that divides it there. And but this wall continues to run all the way up the length of this area. There is more wall underground than there is on top. But that's what remains of the temple today. But to do that, it had to be leveled and hollowed out. And to hold up the mountain, Herod built this large retaining wall. Today, along that wall, from the Wailing Wall on, going to the north, In Jesus' day, it was an open street. You walked the street and the sky was above you. Today, that street is 60 feet below ground. And the Israelis have excavated it, and you can go through and walk on the street that Jesus surely walked on. And this is part of the wall that's under the wall that I showed you. And you walk the tunnel, and you are walking on the very street that Jesus walked on, and you're looking at the very stones that were placed there, some of them even by Solomon, as you get further along. One of the reasons that it could well have been called one of the 7 wonders of the world is the way that they laid the stones. This is one stone. It is 40 feet long, 12 feet high, and 10 feet thick. Weighs over 600 tons. And they haven't the slightest idea how they got it there. But it was not carved out of the mountain there. It was brought there. But how they got it there, no one knows. There are actually several stones of this size that they have discovered. And so the magnificence of this wall is also the fact that as you go along further on the wall, the stones, while there was no cement used, no type of adhesion, you can't even get a slip of paper between the stones. They're set so precisely. The Jews said of the temple, whoever has never seen Herod's temple has never seen a beautiful building. And as you read the accounts, even in the Gospels, of the Jews' attitude toward the temple, they were incensed when Jesus told them, you tear down this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Because this was anathema that anyone would even talk about tearing down the temple. But the fact is, Herod's temple was destroyed in the year 70 AD. Less than a generation after Jesus was ascended into heaven. And Jesus had prophesied, and I showed you this Sunday night, how Jesus had stood and he had prophesied that not one stone would be left on top of another because you did not know the day of your visitation. And when the Romans destroyed the temple, remember this, the temple itself was lined with gold. The temple was set on fire, the gold melted, went down between the stones. And in order to get at the gold, the Romans had to tear the temple down stone by stone, and of course they cast them over the side. But here you can see a depiction of the Romans carrying out the candelabra, because at the time of Jesus there were not 12 candelabras but one. There was one table of showbread, and it was in the Holy of Holies. They brought this out, and we know that they took it to Rome because of other historical records and the fact that it's on the Arch of Triumph there in Rome today. You can see a picture of it. When Jesus said not one stone left upon another, here's the evidence. These stones thrown down from the temple, this is about 60 feet high going up this way now, and these stones were thrown down and they're still there, fulfilling exactly what Jesus said in the Scriptures. The Temple Mount itself was in ruins for several centuries. After it was destroyed in 70 AD, there were very little uses for it. The Romans did at one time have a temple up there to the sun god, and so forth and so on it went, but eventually it became a heap of rubbish. They used it for the city dump. Today, they have excavated just south, this is the southern wall of the Temple Mount, These are the very steps that were there at the time of Jesus. And you can walk these steps, and there's an arch here, which was an entrance for the ordinary common people. These are the steps Jesus would have used, because these were for the common people in the lower part of the city. But the western wall, the kotel, on the western side of the temple, called by Christians the Wailing Wall. You know why they call it that? Because the Jews, when they prayed at the Wailing Wall, you can see the Jewish men there with their prayer shawls and so forth, and they rock back and forth and back and forth, and they make deep wailing sounds. And so the Gentiles who came there called it the Wailing Wall. The Jews call it the kotel, or the western wall. Now the Muslims took over Jerusalem and the temple area in 636. Remember, I told you that Muhammad died in the year 632. This is after Christ. And they went on a wave of conquest, and one of the first places the Muslims conquered was Jerusalem, the Holy Land, and of course the Temple Mount. And the Caliph who took over after Muhammad as the head of the Muslim empire and religion wanted to see the place from which Muhammad had made his night journey into the heaven, because by then this was the site that they said where it happened. And so this Caliph Omar decided that he would erect something up there on top, and he had to even himself gather up some of the garbage. He had to crawl on his hands and knees to get up there. He took some of the garbage over to the wall, and then that was the symbol that everybody else should do likewise. And eventually they built a mosque up there called the Mosque of Omar. And what you see there now is where it stood. And this building was erected there later. The Dome of the Rock, constructed in the year 691, replaced the original Mosque of Omar. And there are many today who think that this is exactly where the temple sanctuary stood. But we're going to talk about that. At the extreme southern end of the Temple Mount, the Muslims built a mosque. Now the Dome of the Rock with the golden dome, that is really a shrine for prayer. It is not a mosque. A mosque is where there's preaching, assembly, and teaching, and so forth. So they built the mosque. This holds 5,000 worshipers. A few years ago, the Muslims got very, very bold, and they started digging underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And they hollowed the whole thing out. So much so that the walls in the southern end and on the eastern side began to bulge, because it had lost its support. And there was a big hullabaloo. And the Muslims, of course, blamed it on the Jews, on Israel. But there was a big hullabaloo as to who was going to repair it, and eventually it was repaired, but not very well. Today they have a mosque under this mosque, which also holds 5,000 people. But you know, it's very interesting, and I'll talk about earthquakes for just a moment. The first time I went to Israel, as I think I mentioned, with 165 Baptists. And it just so happened that on the bus I was on with all these Baptists, there was a Lutheran guide, an Arab. Lutheran church has a large presence over there. Well, when he found out I was a Lutheran, in the middle of all the Baptists, he really took a shine to me. And he showed the Baptist about every Lutheran site there was to see in Jerusalem. But I remember standing on the Temple Mount, and I'm looking across at the Mount of Olives. And this Arab guy came up to me and he said, Pastor Barnard, you need to know you're standing on an